A reading from The Second Bear, Reflections on Motherhood. This is by the Reverend Lynn Unger, who is a minister at the UU Church of the Larger Fellowship in Boston, Massachusetts, which is kind of a UU church by mail and email, especially for people who are not living close enough to a congregation to attend. So here's what she writes. It is a well-known fact among ministers that Mother's Day is a next to impossible thing to preach on. For every person who brings a sainted mother to church on Mother's Day, there is someone else gritting their teeth over the utterly inadequate job their mother did of raising them. And then she says, the more I think about my own experience as a mother, and the more I talk with friends who are mothers, the more I get caught up in what I would call the Goldilocks paradox. You remember Goldilocks? She breaks into the house of the Bear family while they're off on some sort of family outing, and far from feeling ashamed of her reckless and invasive behavior, Goldilocks sets about criticizing everything. The Papa Bear's chair is too big. The Mama Bear's chair is too small. Papa Bear's porridge is too hot. Mama Bear's porridge is too cold. Only the baby bear has things just right. And she concludes, having a child, it seems to me, is a great deal like having Goldilocks break into your home, only without the option of scaring her off at the end of the story. Whoa. This small, imperious being moves in and takes up residence, and there is no way that the parental role will ever be just right. Only the baby gets to be perfect. In any given situation, your response as a parent will be too hard or too soft, too warm or too cold. The job of a parent is to provide children with limitless, unconditional love and set limits, teach boundaries, and self-control. Children cannot thrive without both all-encompassing love and clear boundaries and limits, and those two essential qualities, she says, are invariably at odds. So the chances are good that much of the time what we got from our mother was too hard or too soft, too distant or too confining, too restrictive or too permissive, too demanding or too indifferent. Anything but just right. This reading is how I got my sermon title for today, Goldilocks and Mama Bear. Reverend Unger's words made me think about parenthood in a slightly different way than I had before. You see, most of my life I have judged how my parents raised me, not just in bad ways, but in good ways too. Like my mom was good in that she encouraged us kids to put on plays and create art projects, and I always knew she loved us. But she was not so good in that I think she was sometimes too harsh in her discipline, and she tended to explode at the end of every Christmas day. Perhaps because her own mom had died a few days before Christmas, and she had had to raise her younger sisters pretty much on her own with an alcoholic father. So I've always judged her, both positively and negatively, on what she did and didn't do right. And as for my dad, he was good in that he built things for us kids. He built a little church in the backyard where I could pretend to be a priest in. You don't want to know what kind of kid I was as a child. So he built things like that, but until we were older, he never seemed to enjoy spending much time with us. We always seemed more in the way than fun to him until we were adults. And I've always had some trouble forgiving him for that. So anyway, for most of my life, I've judged how well my parents did their job. And I don't think I'm alone here. I've talked with many others about their parents and how they did or didn't do a good job of raising them. So I know this is a common thing to do. And I've often judged myself, even though I have no kids of my own. I've often wondered how good of a dad I would have been if I'd had children of my own. Would I be as encouraging as my mom or as impatient as my dad? Incidentally, Craig and I, years ago, my husband Craig and I, we watched the movie Mommy Dearest. Any of you ever see that movie? All right. About Joan Crawford and how she raised her kids. And when we were done watching it, Craig said, boy, wasn't she a terrible mother? And I said, I think her kids are just whiners. And he said, what? I said, my parents did a lot worse stuff than just cutting your hair. They beat us. My dad beat us with a wooden paddle and put it in water so it would sting and beat our butts naked. I mean, all kinds of things like that would now be considered child abuse. Anyway, later on, he said, since in our early days we had talked about one day perhaps adopting a child from India, and he teased me saying that Lakshmi was the only Hindu name he knew. So he'd say, what are we going to, but this is what's going to happen. I'll have to say, come on, little Lakshmi, get away, bad daddy's coming. So besides judgments I've made and still make about my parents, I have sometimes added judgments on myself as to how I would have been as a father, or how I am as a minister, which has some fatherly roles embedded into it. So for me, Mother's Day and Father's Day have almost always been about judging, good or bad, either my parents or myself. But then I come across this piece on motherhood and Goldilocks, and I begin to see parenthood in a slightly different way. Rather than judge myself or my parents, or anyone else for that matter, I think of what it might be like to have a stranger enter your life whom you suddenly have responsibility for. Having a child, says Reverend Unger, is a great deal like having Goldilocks break into your home, only without the option of scaring her off at the end of the story. Wow. Was that what it was like for my mom and dad when I and my brothers and sisters were born to them? How could they have prepared for that? Now, one can make the argument that they chose to be parents, so they should have been better prepared. But who ever chooses parenthood with all the facts at hand? I mean, when you decide to become a parent, you may think you know what you're getting into, but each child is sort of like having this little creature break into your house and try this chair and that one and this bowl and the others and beds 1, 2, and 3, and hardly ever be satisfied with anything they see or touch or eat. And then they complain, either when they're still kids or later when they're adults, and probably at both times, about how you didn't give them the right sized chair or the best tasting porridge or the most comfortable bed. When the truth is, they're the ones who broke into your house. What did they expect? Having read this little piece about parenting and realizing that everyone who has a child, whether biologically or through adoption, has in effect invited a stranger to live with them, it has now gotten a little harder for me to judge how good or bad my parents were, or to judge what kind of parent I might have been. And you know, when you further consider that the little stranger who's broken into your house, even when he or she has been with you long enough not to feel like a stranger anymore, when you consider that they're going to become a stranger all over again when they reach adolescence, it's like you keep on having a new Goldilocks break into your house every couple of years. Now, the Reverend Lynn Unger, who wrote this piece and who happened to get her child through adoption, had this to add. In my life, certainly the greatest and scariest adventure into the realm of love was the choice to bring a child into our family. What sensible person would commit to loving a total stranger, some random person off the street? Of course, Jesus said, love your neighbor, but even he didn't suggest you take that neighbor, whatever your neighbor you happen to get, and bring them into your house for the next 2 decades. She says, we're talking love here, not some namby-pamby sort of general goodwill, but unconditional, diaper-changing, tamper-tolerating, hands-on, unshakable love. No questions asked, and no backsies. When you look at parenthood that way, either the parenthood you received or the parenthood you may have given, maybe the question to ask is not, why didn't I get the love I should have had, or why didn't I give the love I should have given, but how does the miracle of love ever happen at all? Because you see, you could ask the same question about your friends or your significant other if you have one. If you have a spouse or partner, that person too is ever changing. as are you. So no matter who they were when you first got together, they're certainly not quite that person anymore. And you aren't who they first fell in love with either. So how do you manage to hold a place in your heart for someone who is, in effect, one stranger after another, as are you? Likewise, with the friends you may keep over years and years, maybe the question isn't, why aren't they better friends? But how did friendship with a complete stranger ever become possible? And how is it that when a new Goldilocks seems to come into my house every couple of years or so, I find a place in my heart for each one? What kind of miracle is that? When I begin to think this way about my parents, about my husband, about my friends, even about myself, there's a slight shift from how good or how bad and a ranking system that pits one person against another. You know, my mom versus someone else's, my parenting versus yours, who got the most breaks, who's the most scarred. My brothers and sisters and I love to do that. Whose oppression is worse, who got off too lightly. There's a shift from that comparison shopping, so to speak, to an utter awe that anyone manages this thing called love at all, let alone poorly or well. How is it that we end up inviting Goldilocks into our home and into our hearts, not just once, but twice, and over and over and over again? How do we do that? Shouldn't that be impossible, or at least very rare? And yet it seems to happen, and quite frequently, in fact. Now, I don't say any of this to dismiss whatever complaints you may have had or might still have against your parents, or to ignore the shortcomings you may feel you exhibited as a parent or partner or friend. These may all be completely valid, and each of us may need to spend time analyzing our past and doing some comparison shopping, if you will. How did my mom stack up against yours? How good have I been as a parent, a spouse, a friend? How scarred or blessed has my childhood been compared to everyone else's? These are interesting questions, fascinating, but they are not the only questions one could ask. Let me put it this way. If you were watching a sunrise or a sunset, there are a couple ways you might do that. One way is to just enjoy the colors you see and ooh and ah over the spectacle. The other way is to watch the sun near the horizon and compare the colors you see with the colors you saw the last time you watched a sunset, or with the colors you've seen in certain photographs that compare favorably or unfavorably with this sunset. Now, both of those are valid ways to look at a sunset, but they are quite different experiences. And you know, when I was preparing this sermon, I went to my Mother's Day file and I found a lot of stories of inspirational parenting and cute stories, sentimental stories, stories that might bring tears to your eye or a wistful smile at some personal memory they could evoke. But I realized they could just as well set up a rating scale for doing comparison shopping. Well, Tony, nice story, but my mother never did that. Or my family upbringing was not so blessed. In fact, I remember as a kid watching Leave It to Beaver almost every week on TV and thinking, boy, I sure got the short end of the stick. Because not only was my family much poorer than theirs, but my parents weren't nearly so nice or understanding as Beaver's were. Beaver's mom and dad were almost always kind and thoughtful, and those few times they made a mistake, they actually apologized for it. My parents weren't like that. Were yours? Why couldn't I have had June and Ward from my mom and dad, or people like them? So rather than set up a comparison shopping adventure for you today by telling you some tender stories about parents that may or may not remind you of your own, let me just say that love of any kind is a sort of miracle. And the fact that any of us is able to invite a stranger into our heart and let them live there without always knowing who they will become or who we will become in the process of having them there is a little like a sunrise or a sunset. We don't have to rate it to find it amazing. We don't have to compare it to other sunsets that we've seen or heard about. It's a miracle all by itself, as are you. I was hoping I would have time for this, and it looks like I do. This is something I want to read you. This, I sort of feel, is one of those things also for people like me who never had children, but who perhaps in some ways have had a parental or nurturing role for others. So in that spirit, I'd like to read you. This is something by Paul Dilliard, who's an author now, but remembers what it was like when he was a little kid. And they had one of those early telephones, you know, the kind where you had a receiver that you put over your ear, and then you talked into the little microphone on the box, a pretty wooden box, and it was screwed into the wall. Well, here's what he says. When I was quite young, my family had one of the first telephones in our neighborhood. I remember well the polished oak case fastened to the wall on the lower stair landing. I even remember the number 105. In those days, you could have 3 numbers for the number of people you had. I was too little to reach the telephone, but I used to listen with fascination when my mother talked to it. Once she lifted me up to speak to my father, who was away on business. Magic. Then I discovered that somewhere inside that wonderful device lived an amazing person. Her name was Information Please. And there was nothing she did not know. My mother could ask her for anybody's number, and when our clock ran down, Information Please immediately supplied the correct time. My first personal experience with this genie in the receiver came one day while my mother was visiting a neighbor. Amusing myself at the tool bench in the basement, I had whacked my finger with a hammer, and the pain was terrible, and I walked around the house sucking my throbbing finger, finally arriving at the stairway. The telephone! Quickly, I ran for the footstool in the parlor and dragged it to the landing. Climbing up, I unhooked the receiver and held it to my ear. Information, please, I said into the mouthpiece. A click or two, and a small, clear voice spoke into my ear. Information? I hurt my finger, I wailed into the phone. Isn't your mother home? Nobody's home but me. Are you bleeding? No. I hit it with the hammer and it hurts. Can you open your ice box, she asked. I said I could. Then chip off a little piece of ice and hold it on your finger. That'll stop the hurt. Be careful when you use the ice pick, and don't cry. You'll be all right. After that, I called Information Please for everything. I asked for help with my geography, and she told me where Philadelphia was, and the Orinoco, the romantic river I was going to explore when I grew up. She helped me with my arithmetic, and she told me that a pet chipmunk that I had caught in the park just the day before would eat fruits and nuts. And then there was a time that Petey, our pet canary, died. I called Information Please and told her the sad story. She listened and then said the usual things grown-ups say to soothe a child. But I was unconsoled. Why was it that birds should sing so beautifully and bring joy to whole families, only to end up as a heap of feathers at the bottom of a cage? She must have sensed my deep concern, for she said quietly, Paul, always remember that there are other worlds to sing in. Somehow I felt better. Another day I was at the telephone. Information, said the now familiar voice. How do you spell fix? I asked. Fix something? F-I-X. At that instant, my sister, who took unholy joy in scaring me, jumped off the stairs at me with a banshee shriek, and I fell off the stool, pulling the receiver out of the box by its roots, and we were both terrified. Information Please was no longer there, and I was not at all sure that I hadn't heard her when I pulled down the receiver unit. Minutes later, there was a man at the porch. I'm a telephone repairman. I was working down the street, and the operator said there might be some trouble at this number. He reached for the receiver in my hand. What happened? I told him. Well, we can fix that in a minute or two. He opened the telephone box and fiddled for a while and then tightened things with a small screwdriver. He jiggled the hook up and down a few times, then spoke into the phone. Hi, this is Pete. Everything's under control at 105. The kid's sister scared him and he pulled the cord out of the box. He hung up, smiled, gave me a pat on the head, and walked out the door. All this took place in a small town in the Pacific Northwest. Then, when I was 9 years old, we moved across the country to Boston, and I missed my mentor acutely. Information, please, belonged in that old wooden box back home, and I somehow never thought of trying the tall, skinny new phone that sat on a small table at our home in Boston. Yet as I grew into my teens, the memories of those childhood conversations never really left me. Often in moments of doubt and perplexity, I would recall the serene sense of security I had when I knew that I could call information, please, and get the right answer. I appreciated now how very patient, understanding, and kind she was to have wasted her time on a little boy. A few years later, on my way west to college, my plane put down in Seattle. I had about half an hour between plane connections. Without really thinking what I was doing, I dialed my hometown operator and said, "Information, please." Miraculously, I heard again the small, clear voice I knew so well. Information. I hadn't planned this, but I heard myself saying, "Could you tell me, please, how to spell the word fix?" There was a long pause, and then came the softly spoken answer. "I guess," she said, "that your finger must have healed by now." I laughed. "So it's really you," I said. "I wonder if you have any idea how much you meant to me during all that time." "I wonder," she replied, "if you know how much you meant to me. I never had any children, and I used to look forward to your calls." Silly, isn't it? It didn't seem silly, but I didn't say so. Instead, I told her how often I had thought of her over the years. And I asked if I could call her again when I came back to visit my sister after the first semester was over. "Please do," she said. "Just ask for Sally." Goodbye, Sally. It sounded strange for information, please, to have a name. I said to her, "If I run into any chipmunks, I'll tell them to eat fruits and nuts." "Do that," she said, "and I expect one of these days you'll be off for the Orinoco." That was the river he wanted to go to. Well, goodbye. Just 3 months later, I was back in Seattle, the airport. A different voice answered, "Information," and I asked for Sally. "Are you a friend?" she said. "Yes, an old friend." "Then I'm sorry to have to tell you, Sally had only been working part-time in the last few years because she was ill. She died 5 weeks ago." But before I could hang up, she said, "Wait a minute. Did you say your name was Paul Villiard?" "Yes." "Well, Sally left a message for you. She wrote it down." "What was it?" I asked. "Here it is. I'll read it. Tell him I still say there are other worlds to sing in. He'll know what I mean." I thanked her and hung up. I did know what Sally meant. Folks, I don't know if there are other worlds for canaries and people to sing in, but I do know that our songs live on in this world, and that there are many people who, throughout their lives, answer our questions and heal our wounds and take our hand. Some of us who don't have kids of our own, or do but they're grown up or on their own, still wish to be mothers and fathers of a sort, and you will find us all around you. We are your teachers, your ministers, your bus drivers, your doctors and nurses, your uncles and aunts, librarian, principal, police, sales clerk, firefighter, friend of the family, maybe even a telephone operator. Give thanks this day for all who have nurtured your life, who have helped you to be who you are. And may you pass on to others the nurturing you have to give so that they, in their turn, will be able to look back at you and give thanks on some future Mother's or Father's Day.